The hall shimmered with gold and white. Balloons floated against the high ceiling, ribbons trailed down like streams of sunlight, and a three-tier cake sat proudly on the center table, adorned with 50 tiny roses made of sugar. Guests filled the room in chatter and laughter, clinking glasses, snapping photos, and hugging each other as if they were part of something grand. After all, a 50th wedding anniversary was no small feat, and tonight's gathering was meant to honor the golden couple who had supposedly weathered every storm together. At the center of it all stood Margaret, her silver hair styled into soft curls, her gown a delicate shade of blue that complemented her calm demeanor. She looked every bit the graceful matriarch, the kind of woman others admired, the kind who seemed to hold a family together by sheer will. Beside her stood her husband, Harold, tall even in old age, still with that commanding presence he'd carried for decades. His dark suit was pressed sharp, his tie perfectly knotted, and his smile stretched wide as if he were the happiest man alive. He greeted each guest with warm handshakes and hearty laughs, basking in the admiration he had long grown used to. 50 years, people kept saying, as if it were a miracle. What a love story. Margaret smiled politely whenever someone repeated it. Love story, if only they knew. Her eyes lingered on Harold, who was now throwing an arm around an old friend and recounting some long-forgotten memory. To everyone else, he was a devoted husband, a pillar of the community, a man who had stood beside his wife for half a century. To Margaret, he was a man who had chipped away at her faith with every lie he told, and every secret he thought she hadn't noticed. But she said nothing. Not yet. The guests were a blend of family and neighbors, some who had known Harold and Margaret since the early years of their marriage. Their children were present too, Daniel, their eldest, with his wife and teenage daughters, and Claire, the younger one, holding her toddler as her husband helped her balance a plate. They, like most children of perfect marriages, had grown up believing their parents' union was unbreakable. Margaret's lips tightened as she thought of what this night might do to that belief. Her eyes shifted toward the front tables where neighbors sat together, and there she was. Nancy, the neighbor who had lived 2 doors down for 30 years. Nancy, with her carefully styled blonde hair and pearls that caught the light as she laughed too loudly at Harold's jokes. She sat close, almost too close, her chair angled toward him as though even tonight she couldn't resist aligning herself with him. Margaret had noticed that detail immediately, though she pretended otherwise. Nancy's husband had passed away nearly a decade earlier, and ever since, she had seemed to find comfort in Harold's company. That's how it began, Margaret had realized years ago. Harmless visits, casual conversations, then the long walks at dusk when Harold claimed he was checking on the neighborhood. She'd seen the way Nancy's hand brushed his arm at barbecues, the way Harold's eyes lingered too long on hers. And while Margaret never voiced her suspicions, she had filed each memory away like pages in a book no one was meant to read. Now, in this glittering hall filled with people who thought they were witnessing love's endurance, Margaret sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her face calm but unreadable. She was waiting. When the toast began, the room grew hushed. Friends and children took turns stepping up to the microphone. Daniel spoke first, his voice thick with emotion as he talked about the lessons of commitment he had learned from his parents. Claire followed, recalling the bedtime stories, the way her mother always listened, and how her father worked long hours but still made time for family dinners. Guests dabbed at their eyes, moved by the warmth of it all. Harold beamed, soaking in the praise. He squeezed Margaret's hand at one point, as if to remind her, or perhaps to assure everyone else, that they were still united. She didn't flinch, but her gaze remained fixed on the microphone. Soon it would be her turn. And when it came, the story told in this room would no longer be one of golden anniversaries and perfect unions. Because Margaret had been silent long enough, she remembered the night she discovered the first undeniable proof. Not the whispers, not the suspicions, but hard evidence. That memory burned in her mind, carrying her through tonight. She had rehearsed every word, not out of spite, but out of necessity. The truth had waited 50 years, and tonight it would no longer hide in shadows. As the laughter and applause rolled around the hall, Margaret's pulse quickened. She smoothed the front of her gown, steadying herself. The next person to be called upon would be her. She rose slowly, her movements calm, deliberate. The chatter dimmed. Harold looked at her with pride, expecting his wife of 5 decades to shower him with affection in front of everyone they knew. Margaret reached for the microphone, her hand steady, her expression unreadable. The golden celebration was about to turn to ashes. Margaret's voice, calm and warm, still lingered in the air as she began her toast with simple words of gratitude. Guests leaned in, expecting a sentimental story, but her mind was elsewhere, drifting back through 5 long decades that had brought her here. To the outside world, Margaret and Harold's marriage looked like a storybook union. They had married young, when the town was smaller and everyone knew each other's business. Harold was the ambitious one, full of charm, while Margaret was the steady hand, the one who quietly sacrificed for the family. Together they built a life, a home, 2 children, and eventually a reputation as one of the most respected couples in their community. But what no one saw was the price Margaret paid behind closed doors. In the early years, she remembered the long nights Harold spent working late, though she never quite believed his excuses. She had 2 small children to raise and bills to manage, so she told herself it didn't matter as long as he came home eventually. When she'd ask gentle questions, he'd brush her off with a laugh, sometimes with irritation, saying she worried too much. And because she didn't want to rock the boat, she let it go. That became a pattern. Harold's dismissiveness and her silence. Over time, Margaret grew used to swallowing doubts. She told herself she had to preserve the image of their marriage, for the children, for the family, for herself. Every woman in her generation was told the same thing. Stand by your husband, keep the peace, look the other way if you must. So she did. Yet in her heart, Margaret noticed the small cracks. Nancy entered the picture years later. She had been part of the neighborhood for decades, but after her husband passed, she became a constant presence. Margaret was gracious at first, inviting her over for coffee, sharing recipes, including her in neighborhood gatherings. She even felt pity for the widow who seemed so lonely. But then came the little things. The way Harold lingered too long at Nancy's fence during his morning walks. The way Nancy's laugh grew louder when Harold was around. The subtle touches that Margaret wasn't supposed to notice. It was easy to dismiss at first. After all, Harold insisted he was only being kind. But Margaret began to feel the shift. Harold coming home smelling of a perfume that wasn't hers. Harold brushing off questions with a sharpness that cut deeper than any answer would have. The worst part was the isolation. Margaret couldn't confide in anyone, not her children, not her friends. To accuse Harold without proof would make her seem bitter, jealous, unstable. And so she carried the weight in silence, hiding her heartbreak beneath polite smiles. Still, she began to keep a mental record. Each late night, each whispered phone call, each excuse that didn't quite add up. She learned to mask her awareness, to act the dutiful wife even as her suspicions hardened into near certainty. One winter evening years ago, Margaret remembered hosting a neighborhood dinner. Nancy had come, of course, dressed too finely for the casual gathering. Margaret watched her and Harold exchange glances across the table. Quick, fleeting, but unmistakable. Their eyes met in a way that spoke of familiarity, of something unspoken but alive. Margaret's hands trembled as she poured wine, yet she said nothing. Instead, she smiled at the guests, laughed at their jokes, and kept her pain locked behind her ribs. That night, when the last guest had gone and Harold retired early, Margaret sat alone in the kitchen. She stared at the half-empty wine glasses, her reflection warped in their curves, and whispered to herself, "I know." But knowing was one thing. Proving it was another. For years, she buried herself in the rhythm of life, caring for her children, later doting on her grandchildren, managing the home Harold claimed as his kingdom, but rarely lifted a hand to maintain. Outwardly, she played her part. Inwardly, she kept waiting, wondering if the truth would ever fully come to light. The irony of it all struck her as she stood at the microphone during the anniversary party. People were praising Harold for his devotion, his loyalty, his years of marriage. They admired the very qualities he had failed to live up to. And here she was, finally given the stage, the moment when her silence would end. Margaret glanced at Nancy, who sat smiling with feigned innocence among the guests. Margaret remembered the years of subtle humiliation, of sitting quietly while Harold praised Nancy's cooking or how neighborly she was. She remembered the times she'd heard whispers outside her window, voices that carried into the night when Harold claimed he was just checking on things. She had endured it all with patience. She had chosen dignity over confrontation. But now as she looked at the sea of faces before her, she realized she had been preparing for this moment for decades. Her life had been built on sacrifice and silence. Tonight, it would be rebuilt on truth. And for the first time in 50 years, Margaret felt the power shifting into her hands. 6 months before the anniversary, Margaret's suspicions, long buried under layers of endurance, finally crystallized into certainty. She had spent decades holding her tongue, convincing herself she could endure for the sake of appearances. But that night, while clearing the laundry basket in their bedroom, Harold's phone slipped from the pocket of his trousers and landed with a dull thud on the carpet. Margaret had never been the kind of woman to pry, but something in the way the screen lit up, a preview of a message with a heart emoji sent well past midnight, made her hand freeze. Her pulse raced as she reached for the phone. Harold, showering in the next room, was humming carelessly, unaware of the storm about to break. With shaking fingers, she opened the message thread. And there it was. Line after line of intimacy that had never been hers. Words that made her cheeks burn with humiliation. Little jokes that had no business leaving her husband's lips. Promises that should have belonged only to her. The name at the top of the screen wasn't hidden either. It was Nancy. Margaret felt her stomach drop. She scrolled further, each message a dagger. Plans for secret meetings, late-night rendezvous at the small motel on the edge of town. Memories of weekends, checking on the fishing cabin that Harold had pretended were solo escapes. He hadn't even bothered to delete them. Perhaps he thought she'd never look. Perhaps he thought she was too old, too trusting, too meek to ever discover the truth. Margaret closed the phone before the water stopped running. She slid it back into the pocket, her hands steady despite the fury rising inside her. For a moment, she stood frozen in the dim light of the bedroom, the weight of 50 years pressing down. She thought of every time she had doubted herself, every time she'd wondered if she was being paranoid, if perhaps she was inventing a story in her mind. Number It had been real all along. The shower turned off. Harold emerged moments later, toweling his hair, greeting her with a casual smile that now made her skin crawl. He kissed her on the cheek, thanked her for laying out his clothes, and went on with his evening as if nothing had changed. But for Margaret, everything had. That night, while Harold snored beside her, Margaret lay awake staring at the ceiling. She thought of leaving. She thought of confronting him. She thought of the scandal it would cause in their family, the pain it would cause their children. But then another thought entered her mind. Sharp, precise. What if she waited? The anniversary loomed only half a year away. Harold had been planning it like a coronation, inviting neighbors, colleagues, even old friends they hadn't spoken to in decades. He wanted to stand at the center of a golden celebration, showered in admiration for 50 years of supposed loyalty, and Margaret realized that was the perfect stage. From that night forward, she began to prepare. She wasn't reckless. She knew whispers wouldn't be enough. She started keeping copies of everything she found. Photos of his text messages, receipts she discovered tucked into his wallet, notes of dates and times when Harold's excuses didn't align. She even asked a trusted friend, a widow who had known her for 40 years, to quietly follow Harold once. The friend returned with photographs Margaret would never forget. Harold and Nancy entering the motel together, laughing as if they had nothing to lose. Margaret tucked every piece of evidence into a small box at the back of her closet, beneath a pile of old quilts. She never opened it when Harold was home, never spoke of it, never hinted at what she knew. Outwardly, she remained the same wife, calm, attentive, polite at dinners, gracious at church. Inwardly, she felt her resolve sharpening. She noticed things she had once ignored. The way Harold's eyes lit up when Nancy stopped by with a pie. The way his hand brushed against hers in the driveway. The smugness Nancy wore like a perfume, as if she relished her secret power over another woman's marriage. Margaret saw it all now, and each moment only fueled her determination. By spring, the anniversary invitations had gone out. Margaret even smiled as Harold showed her the guest list, pretending to be excited. She knew exactly what she was going to do. In her private moments, she rehearsed, not angrily but with quiet precision. She imagined, standing at the microphone, her voice steady as she dismantled Harold's golden image piece by piece. She imagined the silence that would fall, the gasps that would ripple through the room. She imagined Nancy's face paling under the weight of exposure. Margaret had spent 50 years swallowing the truth. Now she would give it back to them all at once. And when she did, she would not falter. The banquet hall pulsed with warmth and laughter as the evening unfolded. Guests leaned across tables, exchanging stories and clinking glasses, their voices echoing against the high ceiling. A string quartet played softly in the background, weaving a golden soundtrack for the so-called golden couple. The air smelled of roasted lamb, buttered rolls, and the faint sweetness of champagne. Harold, ever the center of attention, moved among the guests like a politician working a crowd. He clapped old friends on the back, cracked jokes with his grandchildren, and basked in the admiration that seemed to follow him wherever he went. To anyone watching, he looked like the model husband, a man deeply in love with his wife of 50 years. He glanced toward Margaret often, flashing that easy smile of his, the same smile that had charmed her as a young bride, but now only made her stomach twist. Margaret sat quietly, her hands folded neatly in her lap. To the untrained eye, she looked serene, even proud. But beneath her calm expression, her mind was a storm. Every detail of the evening was part of the stage she had envisioned. The polished glasses, the golden decor, the carefully arranged seating that placed Nancy at a front table where she couldn't hide from a single word. The toast began with Daniel, their eldest. He stood tall, clearing his throat nervously before lifting his glass. "To my parents," he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "You've shown us what commitment looks like. Through good times and bad, you've stayed together. That's no small thing in this world." The crowd applauded, raising their glasses, some dabbing at their eyes. Harold's chest swelled with pride, and he reached for Margaret's hand, squeezing it as if to seal the illusion. She didn't resist, though the contact felt like chains. Next was Claire, her eyes shining as she balanced her toddler on her hip while speaking. "Mom and Dad, you've given us an example of love that endures. You taught us that family comes first, always." She paused, her voice breaking just slightly. "If I can have even half of what you share, I'll consider myself lucky." The guests clapped again, and Harold's face glowed with satisfaction. Margaret felt the words pierce her like thorns, each one a reminder of the lies woven into their so-called legacy. She kept her composure, her lips curving into a small smile that revealed nothing of the storm within. Then came friends and neighbors. Old fishing buddies praised Harold's loyalty. A church friend spoke about Margaret's quiet strength, crediting her as the backbone of the family. And finally, an elderly neighbor recounted how Harold had always been there to lend a hand. Margaret's gaze drifted toward Nancy. She sat elegantly, her pearls catching the chandelier's glow, her smile wide, her laugh a little too bright. Every so often, her eyes flickered toward Harold, and Margaret caught the faintest smirk, as though Nancy relished the secret she thought was still safe. Margaret's hand tightened around her napkin. Not for long, she thought. When the applause faded, Harold rose from his seat, straightening his suit jacket as he made his way to the microphone. The crowd hushed, eager for the husband's grand speech. He tapped the mic, cleared his throat, and began with practiced ease. "Ladies and gentlemen, friends, family, thank you for being here tonight to celebrate what has been the greatest blessing of my life." His eyes swept the room, lingering just long enough on Margaret to make the moment look heartfelt. 50 years with this incredible woman, my partner, my confidant, my everything. A ripple of admiration moved through the audience. Margaret felt her breath tighten, but her expression remained neutral. Harold continued, weaving a story of their early years, their challenges, their triumphs. He told jokes that drew laughter, spoke with the charisma that had always won people over. By the end, the guests were practically glowing, convinced they were witnessing a love story worthy of envy. He raised his glass high. To my wife, Margaret, the love of my life." The room erupted in applause. Margaret's children clapped. Her grandchildren clapped. Even Nancy clapped. Though Margaret noticed how her hands moved a fraction slower, her smile stretched a little too wide. As Harold returned to his seat, the MC called for one final toast. "And now, the woman of the hour herself, Margaret." A hush fell over the room as she stood. She smoothed the fabric of her gown and made her way toward the microphone, her heels clicking softly against the floor. Her face betrayed nothing. Guests leaned forward expectantly, eager to hear the doting wife's words. Harold beamed, convinced she would echo his affection. Nancy sat poised, sipping her champagne, still unaware of the storm gathering just inches away. Margaret took the microphone, her voice calm and steady as she began with words of gratitude. She thanked the guests for coming, thanked her children, her grandchildren, her friends. The room listened attentively, smiling, nodding, expecting sweetness. But Margaret's eyes flickered toward Harold, then toward Nancy, and with that, her tone shifted ever so slightly. The warmth in her voice cooled, the cadence sharpened. She leaned forward, her grip on the microphone steady, and began to tell a story not of devotion, but of deception. The anniversary toast had ended. The reckoning was about to begin. The room was hushed, every eye on Margaret as she stood before the microphone. Her figure looked small against the golden backdrop of balloons and flowers, but her presence commanded attention in a way no decoration could. The quiet dignity in her posture, the calm steadiness of her hands, made people lean forward, eager for the kind of tender speech they assumed would follow. Margaret began as they expected. 50-year, she said softly, her voice even. Half a century with the same man is not something you stumble into. It's a journey, one full of choices, sacrifices, and truths that either bind you together or break you apart. Smiles filled the room. Some nodded in agreement. Her children beamed with pride. Harold, seated just below the stage, gave her a reassuring smile, certain she was about to sing his praises. Margaret continued, her tone gentle at first. She thanked the guests for coming. She thanked her children for their love, her grandchildren for their laughter, her friends for their support. Each word felt carefully measured, layered with warmth that slowly turned sharper, like the edge of a blade still hidden in its sheath. "And of course," she said, turning her gaze toward Harold, "I must thank my husband, Harold." He straightened in his chair, chest puffing, a smile ready for the applause he thought was coming. But no applause came. Not yet. Margaret's expression shifted ever so slightly, a calmness that wasn't sweet but steely. Her voice, still steady, carried a weight the crowd hadn't expected. 50 years of marriage teaches you many things, she said. You learn patience. You learn silence. And sometimes you learn how to recognize lies, even when they're wrapped in love. A murmur rippled through the audience. Harold's smile faltered. Margaret didn't waver. You all see a happy couple tonight. You see a man who appears devoted, a wife who has stood by his side. But what you don't see, she paused, letting the silence expand, are the nights he wasn't home, the excuses, the perfume that wasn't mine, the secrets he thought I didn't notice. The guests stiffened in their seats. Gasps escaped softly from the corners of the room. Harold shifted uncomfortably, his face paling. Margaret held her ground. Her eyes moved deliberately, first to Harold, then to the front tables, and finally to Nancy. And what you especially don't see, Margaret continued, her voice unwavering, is the woman sitting right here tonight, the neighbor, the friend, the widow who found her comfort not in her own home, but in mine, with my husband. The effect was immediate. All heads turned at once, eyes landing on Nancy. Her smile vanished, her hand froze on her glass, and color drained from her cheeks. She stammered, opening her mouth to protest, but Margaret didn't give her the chance. For years, Margaret pressed on, her tone firm, I endured whispers, looks, little gestures I was expected to ignore. I swallowed my suspicions. I played the role of the faithful wife while they played their little game. But 6 months ago, the pretending ended. She reached into her clutch and pulled out a small stack of papers, copies of text messages, receipts, Photographs. The evidence she had so carefully collected. Here, she said, holding them up for the crowd. Hotel receipts. Messages filled with promises and love notes that were never meant for me. Photographs that leave no doubt. Gasps erupted, louder this time. A few guests covered their mouths with their hands. Some looked at Harold with disgust, others at Nancy with open shock. Harold half rose from his chair, his face crimson. Margaret, he hissed, his voice tight with panic. That's enough. But Margaret raised her hand, silencing him without raising her voice. The authority in that gesture stunned even him. No, Harold. 50 years of silence was enough. Tonight, I'm speaking. Her words struck like a hammer. The audience sat frozen, torn between disbelief and fascination. The perfect image they had admired for decades was shattering right before their eyes, piece by piece. Nancy tried to laugh it off, her voice shaking. This is ridiculous, just rumors. Margaret's eyes locked on hers, cold and unflinching. Rumors don't come with hotel receipts. The hall was so quiet then that the hum of the air conditioning seemed deafening. Margaret turned back to the guests, her face calm, her voice clear. So tonight, when you raise your glasses, don't toast to 50 years of loyalty. Toast to 50 years of endurance, because loyalty was never mine to receive. With that, she placed the papers on the table beside the microphone, her hand steady. She raised her glass instead, her eyes scanning the room. To the truth, she said simply. The silence that followed was heavier than any applause. For a long moment, the hall was frozen. No one moved, no one spoke. Glasses hovered midair, forks lay untouched on plates, eyes darted from Harold to Nancy to Margaret. The golden anniversary, meant to be a polished memory for the family scrapbook, had shattered into silence, thick enough to choke on. Then, as if a dam had burst, the whispers began. Oh my God, someone muttered at the back. Did she just? Another gasped. Hotel receipts? A guest hissed, leaning into her neighbor. Margaret stood unmoving, her glass still raised, her face calm. Her silence seemed louder than any of the murmurs spreading through the room. Harold shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. His face was a mask of panic and fury, his jaw clenched tight. Margaret, he growled through his teeth, put that down. You've made your point. But Margaret didn't flinch. She placed her glass back on the podium, folded her hands in front of her, and met his eyes with a gaze that held 50 years of suppressed truth. The guest turned to Nancy, who sat rigid in her chair. Her lips parted as though to speak, but no words came. Her once confident smile had drained into a strained grimace. She fumbled with her napkin, her hands trembling as the weight of 100 eyes pinned her in place. Claire, Margaret's daughter, stood suddenly, her face pale. Is this true? She demanded, her voice breaking. Dad, tell me she's lying. Daniel, the eldest, clenched his fists. His gaze snapped between his mother and father, disbelief hardening into anger. All those nights, all those excuses. He shook his head, his voice low but heavy. How could you? Stop it, Harold barked, holding out his hands as if to contain the fire. This is nonsense. She's twisting things. Margaret, think about the family. The family? Margaret's voice rang clear, slicing through the air. I have thought about the family every single day for 50 years. You thought only of yourself. The words landed like blows. Gasps rose from the crowd again, and someone near the front muttered, Good for her. Nancy finally found her voice, thin and strained. This is humiliating. Margaret, you don't have to do this in public. Margaret turned to her, calm but sharp as glass. No, Nancy, you and Harold did this in private. I'm simply choosing not to keep it hidden anymore. The neighbor's face flushed crimson. A man from her table, her brother perhaps, muttered angrily under his breath, pushing his chair back as if he couldn't bear to sit near her. The ripple spread quickly. Some guests rose discreetly and slipped out, shaking their heads. Others leaned forward eagerly, as though they couldn't look away from the spectacle unraveling before them. A few even pulled out their phones, capturing snippets, despite the weight of the moment. The grandchildren sat wide-eyed, confused, their young faces reflecting only the shock of seeing their perfect grandfather exposed. Daniel's teenage daughter whispered something to her cousin, her voice tight with anger. I'll never look at him the same. Harold's composure cracked further, his face contorted between anger and desperation. He stepped toward the stage, reaching for the microphone. Enough of this circus. You're embarrassing yourself, Margaret. You're embarrassing me. But Margaret calmly stepped back out of his reach. No, Harold. You embarrassed yourself years ago. I'm just no longer willing to carry your shame in silence. The room erupted again, louder this time. Someone clapped, a single sharp sound that cut through the noise. Then another joined, and another. Within moments, a small but firm applause filled the air. Not for Harold, but for Margaret. Harold froze, his eyes sweeping the room, realizing the tide had turned. The admiration he had basked in all night had shifted. No longer the celebrated husband, he was now the deceiver, the liar, the man who had betrayed not only his wife, but the family who had trusted him. Nancy, unable to withstand the stares, pushed her chair back and rose unsteadily. I should go, she mumbled, clutching her handbag. Her heels clicked sharply as she made her way to the exit, her once proud shoulders now hunched. Guests parted wordlessly, giving her no shield of sympathy. She left alone. Harold reached after her, then stopped, torn between chasing her and salvaging what little dignity remained. His hesitation only deepened the humiliation. Margaret remained steady, her hands folded, her face calm but resolute. For 50 years, I played the loyal wife, she said softly, though her words carried across the hall. Tonight, I played the truth. Make of it what you will. And with that, she set down the microphone. The room buzzed with uneasy energy. Whispers, murmurs, the scrape of chairs. The golden anniversary had collapsed into rubble, and standing tall amid it was Margaret. No longer silent, no longer small. The golden glow of the anniversary had dimmed into an uneasy quiet. Guests had begun to trickle out, some whispering in disbelief, others shaking Margaret's hand firmly before leaving. The grand hall, once filled with applause and laughter, now carried only the hollow echoes of scandal. Margaret remained near the stage, calm, composed, as if her very presence anchored the room. She had said her piece. She had no regrets. Her children lingered nearby, hovering protectively, unsure whether to console her or simply stand as witnesses to her strength. Harold, however, was a different picture. His face was ashen, his hands restless, tugging at his tie as though it strangled him. He avoided the eyes of his children, of his friends, of anyone who dared to look at him. His carefully constructed image, the devoted husband, the pillar of loyalty, had crumbled in less than 10 minutes. It was Daniel who spoke first, his voice sharp. You lied to us. For years. You let us believe. He stopped himself, his jaw tightening, fury sparking in his eyes. Do you even realize what you've done to Mom? To all of us? Claire's voice shook as she added, I looked up to you. I told people you and Mom were proof that love could last. And the whole time, you were... She broke off, pressing her hand against her chest as tears welled. Harold reached out as if to touch her shoulder, but she stepped back, recoiling as though his hand burned. The rejection sliced deeper than any words. Kids, Harold began, his voice cracking. It's not what you think. It was a mistake, a long mistake. He forced a hollow laugh, shaking his head. Your mother exaggerated. Exaggerated? Daniel snapped. He grabbed the stack of papers Margaret had left on the podium and thrust them toward his father. These aren't exaggerations. These are facts, receipts, photos, texts. Stop insulting us. The sting of his son's words silenced Harold. For the first time in years, he seemed small. A man cornered not by strangers, but by his own blood. Margaret said nothing. She didn't need to. The truth had already spoken louder than anything she could add. As the last of the guests filed out, only the immediate family and a few close friends remained. The staff moved quietly, clearing plates and glasses, deliberately keeping their eyes down, though the scandal hung heavy in the air. Margaret finally turned to Harold, her voice calm but firm. Do you know what the hardest part was? He looked at her, his mouth opening but no words forming. It wasn't the lies, she continued. It wasn't even the betrayal. It was the way you let me doubt myself, the way you made me feel foolish for noticing what was right in front of me. Her words landed with precision, sharper than any scream could have been. Harold's shoulders sagged, his eyes falling to the floor. Nancy was long gone, and the empty chair she left behind seemed to mock him. Margaret reached for her wedding ring. Slowly, deliberately, she slipped it from her finger. The small band of gold, worn thin from decades of wear, caught the light as she set it down on the table beside her. The sound it made was soft, but final. Gasps echoed faintly from the few who still lingered, but Margaret felt only release. She straightened her posture, smoothing her gown, her hand now bare. Harold's eyes darted to the ring, then to her face. "Margaret, please, not like this. Don't throw away 50 years." She met his gaze without flinching. "I didn't throw them away, Harold. You did." The silence that followed was suffocating. Claire wiped her tears and moved to her mother's side, slipping her arm through Margaret's. Daniel stood behind them, his jaw tight but his stance protective. For once it was clear where their loyalty lay. Harold sank back into his chair, his hand covering his face. For decades he had been the one in control, the man others looked to for strength. But now he sat alone, diminished, with no one left to defend him. Margaret turned to the children, her voice softer now. "We should go. There's nothing more for us here." And so they left, together. As Margaret stepped out into the cool night air, a weight lifted from her shoulders. She had not planned for applause nor for sympathy. What she had planned for was truth, and she had delivered it. For the first time in 50 years, she no longer carried Harold's secrets. He carried them himself now, and the shame that came with them. Margaret inhaled deeply, the night air crisp and refreshing. She had endured half a century of silence. Tonight she chose herself,